So for Blake, like for Austin, this mental fight, um, activating a new kind of attention, a new ability to read historical forces in the here and now. Um, it means dismantling binary oppositions, pride and prejudice, innocence and experience. These conceptual black and white abstractions, these binaries are ways of keeping the transcendent meaning and the experience of the here and now apart. He wants to bring them together. I think that's what Austin also is doing. She's bringing them together, bringing Darcy and Lizzie together. She's mediating, the intermediating this historical conflict, this conflict of historical forces. That's what Blake is all about. And there's something very, very deep about that, related to the romantic philosophical concern with what's called dialectics. Or he also talks about it in terms of contraries. Dialectic means like a conversation, dialogue. Actual history is always about dialectically mediating to conceptual oppositions that are helpful for negotiating our worlds, but are helpful, like language generally, only in virtue of simplifying. So, good and evil, we get a more complex view of how they're actually intertwined by paying attention to particular lives. That's what novels do for us, is they show us how our abstract understanding that we might have in psychology or sociology, how these abstract concepts lack the kind of subtle intelligence or wisdom. Wisdom is a key term. Practical knowledge is wisdom about how things play out in the messy details of actual life. Okay, so we see in Blake always this concern for binaries, this separation, this creator dividing the worlds, heaven and hell, good and evil. He's exploring how the ironies of their overlap. Um, so, in actual human experience, there's always this kind of mediation of two sides. In our mythology, in the stories we tell are always about this interplay of two sides. And just think about how fundamental, foundational they are in your experience of life. You can think about all these different ways we distinguish between public and private, individual and society. More philosophically, we distinguish between substance and accident. Who I really am, and then my accidental expression, appearance, child, adult, body, soul, feeling, reason, woman, man. We're always doing this in order to negotiate the world. And I think it's related, a helpful way of thinking about it, I might have already mentioned, is in terms of what's called arborization, the way in which biological forms in general bifurcate. The leaf forms by bifurcating, responding to the environment, and assuming those fractal shapes that I was talking about earlier. So think about this in terms of the clod and the pebble, which I've already talked about. There we see clearly contrasted all these concepts, heaven and hell, selfish versus compassion, and so on. The poet affirms this ideology in that poem. He's saying the pebble is selfish. It sings a selfish song. The clod represents the compassion of self-sacrifice. Um, but on a deeper level, the irony of the poem is that we recognize, mm, no, they're kind of interrelated if we actually think about the, the clod and the pebble. Um, what is a clod once it's trampled? It's not even there anymore. What is the sound of the pebble in the brook? It's not the pebble, it's the brook around it. Um, and maybe what is a clod that's trampled? Maybe that turns into something hard like a pebble. So what my mind is holding apart in these binary contrasts, my sense experience, if I pay attention to it, reveals a complexity of organic interaction, um, uh, that belies that simplicity. Um, and that has to do with the music of the poem. He's teaching us about reading. He's teaching about what these meters meet, this appropriate song, the meters, the measures of the poem are appropriate to this deeper meaning that the concepts espoused by the poem, heaven and hell, selfish and selfless, don't accommodate. This drawing called the duck rabbit illusion is helpful for understanding what I'm talking about, the difference between poetry and the concepts ostensibly espoused in the poem. You can look at this picture left to right or right to left, see a duck or see a rabbit, but you can't see both at the same time. Same thing in the clod and the pebble. We've got two rubrics. We've got two concepts, a sort of ideological lens that's organizing our experience. But what music does is confuse that stability. Like this illusion, it draws us into an ability not to see them both at the same time, but to toggle back and forth with a kind of musical rhythm. The meter, the measure, the mediation of these two static concepts. It's like a musical awareness, a wisdom of the way things play out, the way things happen in a world like ours. Not pretending platonically to see things from above in this timeless way, which ends up treating, like in The Fly, ends up treating our actual experience of time as meaningless. In a body, bodies don't matter, like flies don't matter. All that matters are time is timeless thought and knowledge. What transcends the temporal world, that Platonic view. But what the poem does, drawing us into its contradictions, what is a body that doesn't matter? What does it mean to read a poem, to experience the bodily effects of music, and at the same time say the body is meaningless and doesn't matter? What does it mean to dance and sing? What are dancing and singing if the body is arbitrarily meaningless? So that's a kind of a way in which poetry, music address the question of wisdom, practical knowledge applied to the weird, irreducibly weird circumstances of actual life. And that's not just what poetry is about, but that's what literature in general about, is paying attention to what's otherwise appear only as accidental, random, giving it a kind of artistic coherence, a temporal rhythm, like Austen's emphasis on the motif of dance and music. Remember, musical performance is a sort of thematic motif of Lizzie and Darcy's love affair. Although Austen, in a way, in her, domestic comedy of manners, is so small scale compared to Blake's visionary prophecies. It's formally the same thing. They're both paying attention to the details of life, of actual temporal life, in order to instruct us, give us a wisdom. Hence what Blake says here, without contraries is no progression. That holds for novels too. Novels are about conflict. Look at this representation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which can be traced back to the French Revolution. I like how it's correlated with music in this video. And this video, it's always collapsing or expanding to different scales of perception. So you'll see what I'm talking about. The point I want to make is simple, that the rights, abstract rights, what the abstract definition sort of negative freedom, you are free to, from interference by other authorities. What that means always has to be applied in somehow a positive way in actual life. What it means to have free speech has to be tested against actual speech. That application of the abstract concept to the here and now. Eternity is in love with the productions of time. Is what's evoked by the music, I think, and the rhythm, and I just think it's a helpful example for thinking about what Blake's trying to do with his art, what the poetry is doing, what literary form generally is doing, including in prose like Austen's. that there's no progress without contraries. Blake interprets that as satanic. That's a strong way of, a direct way of putting it. But Satan is the adversary. It means antagonism. Um, so that's what I'm saying basically about Austen's novel, is that it's about the antagonisms, conflicts, ironies of the particular accidents and details of lived experience. But again, Blake takes it to this extreme of, but I want you to understand the logic of it. That it has to do with the assertion of the value of the here and now against the authority of transcendent, static concepts. There's always something adversarial about that, asserting myself, acting now. The Romantic philosophers talked about action in general as negative, as adversarial. If I'm the world as I receive it is there, it's given. It's a positive presence. I'm, by asserting myself, by acting in the world, I'm interfering. I'm changing, making some kind of negative effect on what I find, what's received in the world. So that's it can sound abstract and philosophical, but it's helpful for getting at what there's a reason behind Blake's infernal method and his emphasis on I'm speaking from the perspective of time. I mean, he's being consistent with Christian orthodoxy in a way. We live in a fallen world, a world of sin. We're exiled from paradise. We speak of heaven, we think we know what that means, we speak of good, but that we're always in a way lying because we live in a imperfect world. So that's why he's always aligning his activity, his energy. Activity is, there's something essentially at odds with orthodox conceptions of true and good. It's also a rebellion against Bibles, sacred codes, the ways in which goodness is holds steady and static. Empire, the marriage in heaven and hell ends by saying empire. The age of empire is over. The age of freedom, of action, self-realization is here. So all the Bibles and Orthodox rules have the following errors: that man has two existing principles, body and soul, that energy, called evil, is the body, that reason is good, is from the soul, that God will torment man in eternity for following his energies. He's saying that that's all self-imprisonment, that's all lies, mind-forged manacles. The truth of the matter is paradoxical, is ironical. Man has no body distinct from his soul. Body is a portion of soul discerned by the five senses, the chief inlets of soul in this age. That's key. So he has a historical sense that we live in an age of empirical rationality. So that's how we codify the body. We turn the body into soul, into meaning, through empirical rationality that articulates the experience of the five senses in objective descriptions of experience. But energy, activity, this infinite flow and a newness of experience in every moment, is the only life, and is from the body, and reason is bound or outward circumference of energy. Energy is eternal delight. Those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. Again, it's functional definition, one of his most famous statements in all of Blake's writing is this point about Milton, Paradise Lost. I was just talking about, exile from paradise, living in the temporal fallen world, and Blake says here, Milton, he's pretends to be pious, to be updating the story of Adam and Eve for modernity, and it being faithful, orthodox. But his poetry is on the side of Satan. He writes much better about Satan than he does about the angels and God, and so Blake's saying he illustrates the same point that music is on the side of the wisdom of temporal life, the joy, exuberance, delight in actual embodied experience of time. And that's always contradicting and antagonizing orthodox meaning. I've emphasized how deconstructing our knowledge means deconstructing these binary concepts. And a key binary is love versus control, joy versus the fear motivates the a desire to control and hold the world fixed in knowledge and moral dogma. So we see that really nicely and clearly expressed in a poem like this. So one thing I want you to think about here in terms of your assignment, in terms of looking at literary form, is the difference between narrative and poetic form. So the story that a poem relates or recounts, and the more musical, formal features of the poem. So this is about going to the Garden of Love. So the Garden of Love, what does that sound like? It sounds like, Eden, this returning from the fallen world of civilization. It promises the first line, this return to the bliss, the innocent bliss of love, but it's gone. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. So the church has supplanted the innocent environment of play and love and natural growth. The gates of the chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So turned I to the Garden of Love, so that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. So just a couple things to notice about that. It's an elegy. That's the story. It's an elegy. It's elegizing, like Wordsworth's Lucy, the loss of love. The narrative is a narrative of loss. The garden is now gone and replaced by graves. But like in Wordsworth, I think there's a suggestion of how the poem, the experience of the poem, the musical aspects of the poem, promise of a retrieval, somehow in the experience of the poem itself, not the intellectual understanding of the narrative, but the present, here and now experience of the music of the poem. There's what I want to suggest in particular is that there's something about the rhythm of the last line. The priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. That's joyous, that's musical. So even as he's telling the story of the loss of love, I think he's suggesting a kind of retrieval of it, not as a story. He's not telling or understanding its retrieval. He's experiencing it or giving it to us to experience in our present reading. Or as I'm going to go on to suggest, the importance of singing for Blake, the actual music of the poem practically accomplishes this retrieval. That we don't have any narrative assurance, any intellectual knowledge of a kind of story that intellectually assures us of its return, but we experience on this more implicit, embodied musical level. This distinction between narrative understanding, the causal sequence narrated by a story, and the sort of logical consequence that you can draw from a story, versus the music, the power of the music, what the music itself communicates, the poetry itself. That's what Blake was getting at when he said Milton was on the devil's side, was of the devil's party when he wrote Paradise Lost, even though he didn't think so without knowing it. So this it's correlated with the different experience of time that I was also talking about earlier. Something different from the mechanism of clock time. It draws us into a kind of flow with the environment, interactivity. So that's what Blake means by saying Milton was of the devil's party, and that's what Blake refers to as his own infernal method. And this is extravagantly elaborated in Blake's art. He, as I mentioned before, invented his own whole new process of printmaking, which has this idea of contraries built into it. He made his prints by dissolving copper plate with acid, and then filling the gaps created with ink. And so he created these copper templates for the prints, upside down and in reverse. So you can see it has this sort of infernal method encoded in his actual practical method. I want to mention a famous essay by the late Romantic writer Thomas de Quincey, most famous for writing The Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Very Blakean writer in his own right. He has a very famous essay called The Knocking at the Gate in Macbeth, where he talks about, there's this detail in the play that always really disturbed him, but he never understood, which was after the murder, a gate outside is just described as knocking in the wind, a loose gate. And De Quincey says, I always found that so haunting, but why? It seems so random. De Quincey makes the point that that's kind of what literature is about. Poetry is about communicating these weird things that you don't understand. If you could understand it and just put it in rational, explicit terms, you wouldn't need literature. Literature, metaphor, works by way of ambiguity. mobilizes ambiguity to communicate emotion, like and imagination, and that's what it shares with music. Music is entirely implicit. It does not explain itself explicitly at all, and yet we can have the feeling that it addresses the emotional life and all sorts of things in a very profound way. So he's just sort of reminding us that. De Quincey begins that essay with an example of how it's not just that the understanding communicates less than literary metaphor or music. It can actually communicate falsely. What we think we understand can actually be entirely misleading. And so he gives the example of if you just ask an average person who doesn't have specific training in how to draw perspective, if you asked the average person to draw what they see when they look down a road, he says that most people probably would not be able to draw what they see, but would draw instead what they understand, which is that the road has two parallel lines. So they would draw two parallel lines. So De Quincey's point there is pretty interesting, which is that our understanding actually gets in the way of our awareness of our own experience. What we know to be the case blinds us to what we actually experience of the situation, our own sense experience is overwritten by what we understand to be the case. It's exactly what Blake is, I think, describing in terms of mind-forged manacles. That our actual embodied experience of the world is trapped in this abstracted prison, the narrow chinks of his cavern, the cavern of our minds. Another example that occurs to me that I think is pretty interesting is learning to ride a bike. It's even, it's something that people say, it's so obvious, like riding a bike is so easy. It's something people say it's as easy as riding a bike. But I think that's another example where what we think we know how to do when we ride a bike is different from what we actually know how to do. Because I think if you asked most people how they turn on a bike, they would, say, they'd say, turn the handlebars right to go right, or turn the handlebars left to go left. But in fact, that's not true. When you're riding a bicycle, you lean the bicycle into the turn, and so you actually turn the handlebars in the other direction. In a way that's called counter steering. And so I'll just show you this little video, and because I think the lesson here is about learning to ride a bike, and how we, the way it's described here, we learn in spite of our instruction rather than because of it. And I think there's a real deep lesson there about how we learn. The tools teach us how to use them. Our experience of the world teaches us more than what we think we understand ourselves to be learning.
Here, as an example, most often, our first vehicle had 3 wheels, like this tricycle. Turn the bars to the right, and it goes right. Turn to the left, and it goes left. Simple. Our first ventures out on 2 wheels usually involved training wheels. Now we have a 4-wheeler. From the tricycle experiences, we instinctively turn right to go right, and it works. In the time-honoured method of training, we raise the training wheels. Now we have a recipe for disaster. We've lost 2 wheels. It's now a frighteningly unstable machine. The child expects it to steer like everything else she's ridden. Look what happens, though. She steers to the right, and the bike tips over to the left. just like all two-wheeled devices.
Let's go for it.
Even with all the bad advice, out of our sense of survival, we somehow make it work.
She has never
But
balanced
do
yet.
we
Lower the training
understand
wheels, you'll kill
the
her.
underlying technology of it?
Look at how the keys
All two-wheeled vehicles steer differently to three- and four-wheelers. To go right, you apply pressure to the right handlebar. That action initiates the turn. The bike then leans over and the front wheel turns into the turn. It's called counter-steering. That's why training wheels are so confusing at first. It's counter to everything the child has learned.
Lean into it. There you go.
So much of what you need to know to get by, you learn out of a sense of survival. And that's, what I mentioned last time, why Blake is a dissenter from the official Church of England. And as I'll get into later, there's a very rich, like today, very rich culture of dissent and interest in pagan spirituality, wide variety of different kinds of spiritual experience and crafts and other aspects of sensuous life and practical life that the official authoritative religion and dogma and the Protestant work ethic and capitalist materialist values neglect. Okay, so with all that said, I want to take you through the Proverbs of Hell. I reordered them thematically. I have to kind of put them into two basic groups of innocence and experience as these overarching categories in Blake's thought. But so much of how we survive is by implicit knowledge, what goes unstated. It's perspectival, contextual, interactive motions, attitudes, ideologies. And in our modern Christian world, we our experiences, our sort of life stories are governed by this broad categorical distinction that we've already been looking at. The Garden of Love, the distinction between innocence, the innocence of paradise, and the fallen world of experience, life in the corrupt temporal world. So he's interrogating the way in which adult understanding, the understanding of experience, ostracizes innocence as this other world of the lost paradise, either of Eden or of childhood, and justifies this kind of cruel understanding of knowledge as joyless and self-imprisoning, basically. But it's complicated, and there are different versions that he wrote of the Songs of Innocence experience, and sometimes the songs are switched around. Remember, there's nothing schematic about Blake. He's about dissolving these binaries. So the world he wants to draw us into, this infinite world, is one of increasing complexity and interdependence. There's nothing dogmatic or schematic in the way in which he tries to deconstruct these. He's trying to expose the way in which they're interrelated. So here, everything possible to be believed is an image of truth. What is now proved was once only imagined. Truth can never be told so as to be understood and not believed. The point he wants to make here is that when you imagine there's something, you're exercising a freedom of your own to decide the truth. He's always trying to get us, nudge us out of this passivity of mind that believes truth to be out there, independent, just given. We either um, it's up to us to ratify what's true, and we can always dissent. That idea of dissent goes very deep into what Blake's about. Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion. So you see, like, the law creates crime. The hours of folly are measured by the clock, but of wisdom no clock can measure. So again, the what's mechanistically recorded by a number, weight, and measure is sort of the opposite of life. Improvement makes straight roads, but crooked roads without improvement are roads of genius. Creative, expressive life is what isn't measured by, isn't empirically measurable or quantifiable. What doesn't fit, just like De Quincey said, is what really matters. What you understand, what fits in your understanding is effectively meaningless. It's your experience has value only to the extent that it is an experience of this crookedness. What isn't just a repetition, inane repetition of a mechanical reality. So this is what he's talking about here, is ideology. The crow wished everything black, the owl everything white. Ideology just is a negation of what experience actually is supposed to be. As air to a bird or sea to a fish, so is contempt to the contemptible. The medium of your life, the air, as the air is to a bird, or the sea to a fish, you live in a world of the law of contempt for actual experience. The apple tree never asks the beech how he shall grow, nor the lion the horse how he shall take his prey. Again, the same point about the individual, the crookedness. You have to find your own path. If you're taking, one law for the lion and ox as oppression, if you're taking your law from another, you're just sacrificing yourself. Expect poison from standing water. It's a nice allegory. If you're just the static law, the standing water is poisonous. It's hostile to the dynamic flow of life. Who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. So that's, again, self-contempt, self-suppression. And it's correlated with morbid standing static law that just wants to contain and control and imprison life. The cistern contains, the fountain overflows. So life is about overflowing, excess. Again, what you don't understand, the experience, a new experience. So if you're weak, if you fail to overflow, you're strong and cunning, you're strong in rationalizing. Shame is pride's cloak. Use cunning to rationalize yourself. You express shame to hide your pride. The general hypocrisy of so much of our explicit communication. The tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction. So again, that idea, you learn in spite of instruction, out of a sense of survival. The tigers of wrath teach you to be wise. the punishment of life is tells you more, it gives you more wisdom than ostensible explicit instruction. So he who has suffered you to impose on him knows you. I impose on you by forcing you to, to believe my story or my version of myself, my shame, my cunning. But what you should really learn from me is my imposition, not what I actually say. A dead body revenges not injuries. Drive your cart and your plow over the bones of the dead. So again, the deadness of the law, the deadness of tradition. What matters is actual experience now. That it is excessive and infinite possibilities. Reverence for the past, for convention, just limits you. Okay, so that's just to walk through the Proverbs in a way that I think hopefully makes them a little more comprehensible. And here's and by contrast, a set that might be categorized more under the rubric of innocence and the affirmation of creative life, experimental action, liberated from dogmatic understanding. Most famous of the Proverbs of Hell. Sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse unacted desires. So the same thing as that other one about unacted desire breeds pestilence. If you're repressing yourself, that's there's a morbidity, a systemic morbidity in self-repression, systemic violence that in nursing unacted desires, you're breeding pestilence in a systemic way. That's it's like a disease, and he wants to point out that's not just one death. That's you're spreading a disease. But he, obviously puts that in a very provocative way, and really challenging, like the idolization of children. Murdering an infant, but this is on the side of innocence. He wants to say, believe in your desire, don't suppress it. If the innocence, if you really believe in innocence, trust it in yourself first. Exuberance is beauty. Beauty is not outside you, it's in you. It's your experience of exuberance in the face of beauty. This thankful receiver bears a plentiful harvest. The same point. The plentiful harvest is in the experience of gratitude. So see these liberating, liberating your mind, and these shifts in perspective that transform the equation of reality. So much of this, I think, boils down to looking at the glass half full rather than half empty. Seeing gratitude for the bounty that seeing what life gives you as a bounty rather than as a lack. No clock can measure the hours of wisdom. So it's ironic, the hours of wisdom aren't measured by a clock. They're hours, but it's a different measurement of time. It's wisdom is again about that something infinite, something that overflows the limitations rational empirical measurement. And that is what he's getting at. I think it's a real important one too. The fool sees not the same tree as a wise man sees. So actually a different world outside. It's like this one here, where man is not, nature is barren. The world is created by how we see it. And that sounds really facile, but as I'll go on to suggest, and when I talk about his critique of Newton, Newtonian physics is incredibly prescient and ahead of his time. And so what he's saying here is actually something that's only been corroborated, by science in the 20th century with like quantum mechanics and relativity. This is what he's talking about. The world, there is no outside empirical reality without observation. The world we see is a function of our active observation of it. It's not just passively there, or our perception of it isn't just a passive recording. We're actively organizing the world that we perceive, and it makes a big difference whether we're doing it foolishly or with some kind of wisdom. And the word tree, the fact he's talking about tree, he's talking about the environment, he's talking about natural resources that are, were already in his time being exploited. So to see the natural world just in terms of resources to be extracted, rather than seeing it as a complexly interactive ecosystem, makes all the difference, as we're experiencing every day. So again, one thought fills immensity. We are creating the way in which we think. It determines what immensity is, what eternity is. Likewise, eternity is in love with the productions of time. This is not just about eternity here, that we're always determining the eternal in the way in which we fill our time, our hours, wisely or foolishly. But this is also a question, what's at stake here is also love. Whether we fill our time with love or with contempt for life. To create a little flower is the labor of ages. The labor of ages, everything that's come before. If others had not been foolish, we should be so. Again, that deep interactivity, that's sort of an environmental awareness. The most famous line maybe of Blake, there's so many, keep saying that, but the idea of there's infinity in a grain of sand. Each little piece is involved in everything else. So we learn from the past, or we inherit the learning that others have made in the past. Likewise, if a fool would persist in his follies, he would become wise. The environment will teaches us what we need to know. What we fail to know, the environment will teach us. So again, that's, I think, the environmental catastrophes that we're experiencing. The fool is trying to teach the fool to see a tree more wisely. And again, to the fountain overflows. We learn by going beyond ourselves. The fox condemns the trap, not himself. So that's it again. He's pointing out our tendency towards self-contempt, self-limitation, self-condemnation. This is my favorite of the Proverbs of Hell. The bird a nest, the spider a web, man friendship. So our home is in our social relationships, our social communication, and the category of friendship is so crucial for romanticism, because it's the most open-ended, most creative category of social relationship. Most liberated from the patriarchal hierarchies, the hierarchical arrangement of the nuclear family and other kinds of social hierarchies. Friendship is self-creating. What friendship means is what friendship does, and that's what. That's how we nest. That's how we create our habitat in the world. That's how we flow beyond ourselves in the world.